Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook, and we're focusing this week on this is the course for religion in Latin America in the fall of 2020 at FIU in the 10th month of the great healthcare crisis of 2020, and I believe it's week 9. And this week we're going to talk about the expanding Protestant presence in Latin America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I have my notes open here. I didn't have time to produce a Prezi this time, as much as I enjoy those. So we're just going to go through my notes. So we talked last week about the early arrivals of Protestants in Latin America, especially through diplomatic channels, through education, and now we're going to talk about the gradual expansion of Latin America as more and more Protestants began to arrive. And a lot of this came right at the peak of conflicts between liberals and conservatives in countries such as Argentina, Colombia, Mexico in particular. The conservatives tended to be very pro-Catholic, pro-monarchy, pro-military, and pro-Spain, and wanted to maintain a unified moral consensus that was Catholic and Hispanic. Whereas the liberals, although they might have been faithful practicing Catholics themselves, were anti-clerical. Anti-clerical meaning they felt like the Catholic Church was standing in the way of modernity and progress in Latin America, and that priests and bishops should not be involved in politics. And so you see these wars in a number of countries between conservatives and liberals, in particular in Colombia that I'm more familiar with, from about 1849 through 1880. The liberals were ascendant, and they were passing laws to separate church and state, to disestablish the Catholic Church, to guarantee religious freedoms. And then this pendulum swung the other way in the 1880s and back to the conservative side. So the liberals tended to welcome Protestant missionaries into their countries in the hope that they might undermine conservatism. I think we saw this a few weeks ago when some of you read Simon Bolivar's various letters and comments on freedom of religion. He would have, on this issue, he would be considered on the liberal side. And so I'm fussing with my camera. This is also during the same time period that the United States declared the Monroe Doctrine and declared the Western Hemisphere off limits to Europe. Also, there was a rising ideology in the United States called Manifest Destiny, in which the historic destiny of the United States was seen to be to promote and defend democracy in the world. There's also during this time period that the U.S. and Mexico went to war over Texas. Latin American Catholicism was depicted by many Protestants as superstitious, obscurantist, and syncretistic. Protestants criticized Latin American Catholicism as being pagan because there was some residual indigenous practices in the popular Catholic practice. There was also what's called the Second Great Awakening in the United States and to some degree in Great Britain, and this stirred up religious fervor, and a number of British and U.S. Religious leaders began to talk about missions and become very involved in promoting missions. I can't get my camera right. I keep adjusting it, but it won't quite adjust. There, that's a little bit better. Nope. Let's try it over here. I'm trying to get centered. There we go. I don't know what I was doing wrong. Okay, so the Second Great Awakening was happening. There was a number of what's called revivals. The Cane Ridge Revival was a very famous one. And it also took on a bit of an anti-intellectual bent, the Second Great Awakening. So, in contrast to the earlier Protestants that were in Latin America, those who went after 1820 were much more conservative and much less educated, partly because of the anti-intellectual mood of the Second Great Awakening. By the middle of the 19th century, there were American missionaries in every country of Latin America. So that was a pretty radical change in just about 20 or 30 years. Of course, by the next century, with the Cold War and the advent of liberation theology, evangelical and Protestant missionaries became divided over ideology, with conservatives criticizing those who they perceived as more liberal as being Marxist sympathizers. The beginnings of the Protestant expansion in Latin America began with a man from Scotland by the name of James Diego Thompson. This fellow is pretty incredible in his travels. He went to Argentina in 1818 as representing a Bible society, and he was distributing Bibles. He was having them shipped to him, and he would sell them. He also represented education. He particularly represented a method of education called the Lancaster system, or Lancastrian. So he was welcomed into Argentina by some of the liberal leaders, ostensibly to set up schools. He was so successful in Argentina that a few years later, he was granted honorary citizenship in Argentina in recognition of his work in education. By 1821, he was invited to Chile, basically did the same thing there. A famous Chilean by the name of Bernardo O'Higgins. I misspelled that. Let's put an N in there. Bernardo O'Higgins, a descendant of an Irish Catholic family, welcomed him into Chile. He founded more schools in Chile, and he also was made an honorary citizen of Chile. Then he traveled to Peru and met San Martin, the famous Argentine liberator, and was also granted, and as I already said, he was also granted citizenship of Chile. He got caught up in the back and forth of the war in Peru with Spain and had to leave Lima with the San Martin's troops. When they finally were able to go back into Lima, he recruited people to translate the Bible into Quechua and Aymara. In 1824, he moved on to La Gran Colombia, which at that time was composed of Ecuador, modern Colombia, and Venezuela. And so he moved on there to continue his work, almost making the circuit of South America. And he worked in Quito and Bogota. I don't recall if he made it to Venezuela. I think at some point he went to Venezuela. And then in 1826, he returned to England for a year of furlough and then moved to Mexico City with a wife, where they had 2 children. Both children died tragically while they were in Mexico. Lucas Matthews, another missionary, was sent to South America to replace Thompson, but when he arrived in Colombia, he somehow mysteriously disappeared, and no one ever found out what happened to him. Lucas Matthews. In Mexico, the Bishop of Puebla collaborated with Diego Thompson and ordered the Bible to be translated in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, although he died before it could be carried out. Thompson also was in Mexico, but when the Cristero War broke out, he returned from England and went from England to Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, Antigua, and finally made it to Venezuela. So he made the rounds of the Caribbean after the violence in Mexico broke out. The Cristero War was a war between the Mexican federal state and Catholics, because after the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican state was trying to crack down on and limit and control the Catholic religion, separating church and state, and secularizing education. So a little bit about the role of Bible societies. One of the ways that missions were carried out was that representatives would go to various countries representing the Bible societies and selling Bibles, and not necessarily doing mission work, not necessarily education or establishing churches, but simply distributing Bibles as widely as possible. Andrew Milne was a Scotsman who was appointed in 1864 to represent the American Bible Society in Uruguay and later in Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Venezuela. one of his associates was Francisco Pinzatti, who became Milne's first convert and became a pioneer of Protestantism. By the way, the first Protestant services held in Spanish were held in Milne's home. Before that time, Diego Thompson and others had held church services, but in English with expats. So Pinzatti converted to Protestantism through Andrew Milne, and he organized the church in Peru. And while he was there, he was sent to prison for 8 months for disturbing the peace, I suppose, by preaching Protestantism. In 1890, his congregation joined the Methodist Church, and La Reina y Valera translation of the Bible in Spanish became one of the jewels of Spain's golden age of literature. That was the first Spanish Bible that I read, was the Reina y Valera. It's basically the equivalent of the contemporary King James Version in English. So the Protestant Bible societies preferred to print Bibles without notes. In other words, without editorial commentary. Anglicans tended to support missions to South America. I'm sorry, I misread that. Anglicans, which is the Church of England, an established church, which broke off from the Catholic Church, they opposed missions to South America as not legitimate because they considered South American Catholics to be Christian brothers and sisters, and therefore missions to Catholics was not legitimate. It was unwarranted proselytism. So therefore, when Anglicans got involved in South American missions, they tended to focus strictly on native indigenous populations rather than Latin American populations that were already Catholic. And an example of one of the first Anglicans to go to South America as a missionary was Alan Gardner, a British naval captain who had visited Chile while he was serving in the Navy. In 1838, Gardner visited an indigenous group in Tierra del Fuego for a short time. He eventually settled in the Falkland Islands, which are known as the Malvinas in Argentina, as a base, but they were controlled by the Great Britain, the Falklands were. And so it was a logical place for him to settle as a base to reach out to indigenous peoples in South America. He and a group of missionary companions moved to Tierra del Fuego to set up a mission to reach out to the indigenous peoples there. They had arranged for a ship to bring them supplies once every 6 months. The ship didn't arrive, and when finally somebody did go looking for them, they found that the entire group of missionaries had starved to death. He left a diary behind, though, inspiring people to continue to reach out to indigenous peoples as Christians. This story is very tragic. Not only did he starve to death, but his son and his grandson both died attempting to carry out his mission. In 1859, Gardner's son followed in his father's footsteps, but when he got to Tierra del Fuego, he and his companions were killed and eaten by the local inhabitants. And then Gardner's grandson tried again years later, but fell ill and died shortly after his arrival. So you might almost think that there's some kind of curse on that endeavor. Alan Gardner, his son, and his grandson all lost their lives in that pursuit. A bit of a tragic story. Anglicans also worked among peoples of African descent along the Caribbean coast of Central America. One example being Belize, also the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua. So political issues. There was a lot of intertwining of politics and religion in this area. I've already mentioned the conflict between conservatives and liberals over education. Conservatives wanted to keep it strictly in the hands of Catholics, particularly Jesuits, whereas liberals felt that that was holding back their societies and keeping peoples in ignorance and superstition. Even though these liberals were themselves Catholics, they felt like they needed a more modern and liberal, open liberal education. And so the liberals decided to, in many cases, to invite Protestant groups to send missionaries to open schools. And one example of this was in Guatemala. where a caudillo by the name of Justo Rufino Barrios became the president in 1873. I once mentioned that Justo Rufino Barrios was a liberal caudillo or dictator. And one of the students in my class argued with me and said, no, it's not possible that liberals could be dictators. But in South America and Latin America in general, you see caudillos or dictators that come from both liberal persuasions and conservative persuasions. I talk about that in another class, about the vacuum of authority that was in Latin America after they separated from Spain. And usually the people that stepped in to fill that vacuum were known as caudillos. So Rufino Barrios became president in 1873. His dream or his vision was to unify Central America, or reunify it. It had at one point been part of Mexico, and then it broke off and was the United States of Central America. And then the various states within Central America broke up from one another. And his dream was to reunify Central America and bring about liberal reforms. He was killed in 1885 trying to forcibly reunify the provinces while leading an invasion of El Salvador. But before he died, he had expelled the Jesuits and promoted public education. And he also, at one point, traveled to New York and invited Presbyterians to send missionaries to Guatemala. And so the first Presbyterian church was organized in Guatemala in 1884 at the invitation of Rufino Barrios. In Colombia, it was a similar situation. The liberals were in power and had stayed in power from 1849 to 1880 when the pendulum swung the other way. In 1850, the Jesuits were expelled under the liberal regime, and anti-clerical measures were taken. Remember, anti-clerical means to limit the political influence of religion or the church. It doesn't mean anti-religious, but simply to limit the political involvement of church officials. North American Presbyterians sent their first missionaries to Colombia in 1859. Also, Lucas Matthews had disappeared in Colombia as a missionary. I don't recall if he was Presbyterian. The Presbyterians started Colegios Americanos. So there's still some of them open today, and I think there's one in Barranquilla. Most liberals were not Protestant. They were normally Catholic, but nearly all Protestants were liberals. It's just the opposite as the perception here in the United States that evangelicals, Protestant Christians are conservative. But in Colombia, because the conservative party was so tightly aligned with the Catholic Church and it was pro-Hispanic, pro-Catholic, pro-monarchy, if you were a Protestant convert in Colombia, you would tend to sympathize with the party that advocated separation of church and state and guaranteed religious freedoms. And that was the Liberal Party, who advocated separating church and state and restricting the political influence of the church and guaranteeing religious minorities the right to worship. So most Protestants in Colombia were liberals. And this becomes a problem later on when you have in the 20th century La Violencia, which was it was kind of a civil war. It was 10 years of unremitting violence between conservatives and liberals in Colombia. But a lot of Protestants suffered because they were also liberals. And so in a liberal village, you might have a handful of Protestants of the small church, whereas the entire village was liberal. But when the conservatives came and attacked the church, they would burn down attack the town. They would burn down the church and persecute the Protestants as well as defeat the liberals. And of course, it went back the other way too, with liberals attacking Catholic villages. So Colombia was in an uproar right up through the late 20th century. In Mexico, it was something similar. You had what was called La Reforma, led by Benito Juarez, who was a full-blooded Zapotec Indian. A woman became his patron and made sure he learned to read and write and sent him to a school. He ended up becoming a lawyer, and he rose through the ranks of the Liberal Party in Mexico and eventually became president of Mexico during a time of tremendous crisis. Benito Juarez kind of occupies the same place that Abraham Lincoln does for U.S. citizens. He is a heroic figure, Mexican figure for the 19th century. And he also his party was the winner of the Civil War between conservatives and liberals, and then they instituted La Reforma, in which they enacted anti-clerical measures. They separated church and state. They limited the amount of wealth and landholdings that the church could hold. They enacted guarantees of freedom of religion. And they also hoped that a Mexican national church would emerge, somewhat like Great Britain, where you have the Anglican church was split off from Rome and became a sort of Catholic Church of England. That's one way to put it. So in 1861, two ex-Catholic priests founded La Iglesia Mexicana, patterned after the Anglican Church. Instead of the Church of England, it was the Church of Mexico. It was not very successful. They did something similar happened in the 20th century after the Mexican Revolution, where the federal government tried to encourage the beginning of an indigenous Mexican church with severed ties with the Vatican, called the Catholic Orthodox and Apostolic Mexican Church, and the head of that church was the Patriarch of Mexico. Again, it didn't succeed very well. Catholicism's roots were too deep in Mexico. So in terms of institutional development, the first message in Spanish was preached in 1867, a half a century after Diego Thompson. There was a Patagonian Missionary Society working among the Guarani Indians. In Chile, you had a missionary that began holding Protestant services with severe opposition from the Roman Catholic leadership. After 22 years, he was finally able to lead worship publicly and in Spanish, and he had 4 members. Huge growth. 22 years and you have 4 members. That would be discouraging. Methodist William Taylor is another significant figure. He traveled along the coast of Chile and found British merchants, people who were English speaking, that were there for commercial reasons, and he gathered them in homes and formed English speaking congregations along the coast of Chile. In Colombia, there was in 1855 there was a former Spanish priest named Ramon Monsalvaje, who was shipwrecked near Cartagena. He was Spanish, and he found a copy of the Bible and ended up converting to Protestantism and becoming a significant leader of Protestantism in Colombia. Also in Colombia in 1856, there was a Presbyterian missionary working in H.B. Pratt. In Brazil, I don't know if I want to go back this far, but in Brazil you had Calvinist French Calvinists called Huguenots that tried to settle in Rio de Janeiro in 1557. That's all the way back shortly after people began to arrive in the Western Hemisphere. They were defeated by Brazilians and the Portuguese and eventually had to leave. Interestingly, they also founded another community near Jacksonville, near St. Augustine in Florida. And again, they were defeated by the Spanish, allied with some Indians, and they were forced to leave the New World. Jose Manuel de Concesión In Brazil was an ex-priest from Sao Paulo, 40 years old, and went through a crisis of faith. He did not attempt to start churches after he found a Bible. He began reading it. He converted to faith, basically in a Protestant form of faith, but he didn't try to start churches. He simply traveled around speaking to Catholic parishes and former Catholic friends, sharing what he had learned from the Bible with them, so that many of them came to a Protestant theological understanding, but not necessarily joining Protestant churches. After years of doing that, it took a toll on his health, and he collapsed on the road and died. But before he died, a person found him and attended to him as he was dying, and was so provoked by this person that he found by chance on the road that he looked into his background, began to research his faith. This person who found him also converted to Protestantism and eventually wrote a book about Jose Manuel de Concepcion. So he was an interesting figure. I've already talked about Guatemala. In Cuba, after the Spanish-American War, you had the early beginnings of Protestantism. Also in Tampa and Key West, many Cubans were attending Protestant churches and converting to Anglicanism or other forms of Protestantism. Puerto Rico, a fellow by the name of Antonio Badillo Hernandez found the Bible, started reading it, came to a Protestant theological understanding of faith, and began to share that with other friends and neighbors, and inviting people to his house to read the Bible with him, and basically started the first church in Puerto Rico. So this brings us to a time of unrest in Mexico, picking up with Benito Juarez. The French tried to intervene in Mexico. The conservatives actually, after losing the Civil War, asked the French to send a monarch with troops to establish a French monarchy in Mexico. They weren't quite willing to give up their fight for control. And so the Emperor Maximilian arrived in Mexico, sent by Napoleon III, along with armed French troops to support his authority. The conservatives swore allegiance to Maximilian, and now the liberals and conservatives were back at war with French troops on the side of conservatives. This was a bit ironic because Maximilian actually himself was personally liberal in his views, and he wanted to be a liberal monarch for Mexico, but he was being supported by the conservatives. So, the book says here that in the fight against the French, among the liberal Mexicans who fought against the French, there were 2 Protestant generals and 18 Protestant colonels in that fight. Obviously, they were not pacifists. So eventually Maximilian, if you never heard the end of the story, was defeated. His troops were defeated. They left Mexico. He was captured and executed. Didn't work out very well. Let me see, what else do I want to cover here? I'm not going to try to get in all the details. So also near the end of the chapter, it talks about the birth of the modern ecumenical movement, which began in the World Missionary Conference held in Edinburgh in 1910. And they explicitly excluded Latin American Protestants from its agenda, out of opposition from Anglicans and Lutherans, who felt like Protestants should not be proselytizing Catholics in Latin America. They did not consider Latin America to be a legitimate mission field because Latin America was already Christian. That's an interesting point. More conservative Protestant groups didn't have those compunctions. They were more than willing to steal sheep from the Catholics. In 1916, there was another meeting in Panama, the Primer Congreso de Acción Cristiana in America Latina. And then there were congresses held in Montevideo and Havana. These meetings were organized by the so-called traditional or mainline Protestants. Evangelicals also began to plan planned their meetings beginning around 1969 in Bogota, el Congreso Latinoamérico de Evangelización. And so these various ecumenical groups are very polarized over social issues. CDCAL tends to be more liberal and more supported by mainline Protestants. CALADE tends to be more conservative and is supported by conservative evangelicals. So the conclusion of this chapter is that traditional Protestantism or mainline denominations have fallen far behind both Roman Catholicism and Pentecostalism, which we are yet to get into. Traditional Protestantism or mainline denominations have fallen behind. They haven't grown rapidly in Latin America, partly because they're a foreign implant, which is different than Pentecostalism, which has become indigenous. After Vatican II, it became more difficult for Protestants to promote their faith and their churches by simply criticizing Catholicism. There's still a lot of bitter feelings among many evangelicals toward Catholics in my experience in Colombia, and I'm guessing in Mexico as well. And the feeling is mutual. A lot of Catholics who resent evangelicals as wolves who are stealing the sheep. However, Vatican II changed the image of Latin America, changed the image of Catholicism with a lot of people, and made it harder to attack it as being syncretistic or pagan. So that's all I have for this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's helpful. And stay safe, stay healthy. And as always, send me a message or an email if you have any questions or need help with anything. Take care.